Hello Guy, welcome back to my new channel. In the quiet moments of our modern lives, we are surrounded by a world of ghosts. Not the spirits of folklore, but the echoes of forgotten genius. The shape of the letters on this screen, the concrete beneath our feet, the very concept of a measured hour we exist atop a mountain of ancient innovation. A landscape carved by minds who lived and dreamed millennia ago. Their creations were not mere conveniences. They were the keystones of civilization itself, the fundamental technologies that allowed cities to rise, empires to expand, and ideas to outlive the flesh that conceived them. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine for a moment a world without words, not without speech, but without the physical form of a word. A world where every thought, every story, every piece of hard-won wisdom is bound to the fragile vessel of human memory. In this world, history is a ghost, a tale told around a flickering fire, as fleeting as the breath that carries it. Law is not written in stone, but remembered in the mind of an elder, subject to the frailties of age and the mists of time. An agreement is a handshake, a promise is a spoken oath, and when the speakers are gone, the promise dissolves into air. Humanity, in this state, is a species with a peculiar kind of amnesia, each generation forced to relearn the vital lessons of the last, rediscovering fire, reinventing the wheel, and refighting the same battles, to build something that would outlast a single lifetime, a city that could grow beyond a village, a kingdom that could govern more than a few tribes, a legacy that could speak to the unborn, required a technology of breathtaking power. It required a technology that could conquer time, silence death, and give an idea a tangible body. It required the invention of writing. Our story of this monumental leap begins not in a philosopher's academy or a king's grand hall, but in the sun-scorched plains of southern Mesopotamia, the fertile crescent cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, more than 5,000 years ago, around 3,500 BCE, the Sumerian people were building the world's first true cities. Uruk, one of humanity's earliest metropolises, was a testament to their ambition. Its population swelled, its temples reached for the heavens, and its markets buzzed with the exchange of goods and labor. But this newfound complexity, this very success, created a problem of immense scale, a challenge that was thoroughly unglamorous, yet civilization-altering: administration. How does a temple priest, responsible for the city's relationship with its gods, keep track of the immense quantities of grain, beer, and livestock offered as tribute? How does a merchant, sending a caravan across the desert, record a debt owed to him in a distant town? How does a king seeking to rule a growing territory tally the wealth of his subjects to levy taxes and raise armies? Human memory, for so long the sole keeper of records, had reached its breaking point. It was no longer a reliable tool for managing the intricate workings of a city-state. The solution, when it came, was born of the very earth beneath their feet, river mud and marsh reeds. In its earliest form, it was a system of accounting that used small, stylized clay tokens. Each token's shape represented a specific commodity: a small cone for a measure of barley, a cylinder for a domestic animal, an ovoid for a jar of oil. To conduct a transaction or record a temple inventory, these tokens would be sealed inside a hollow clay ball about the size of a fist called a bulla. If a dispute arose, the bulla could be broken open, and the tokens inside would serve as a physical, indisputable record of the agreement. But this system had an obvious flaw. How do you remember what's inside the sealed envelope without breaking it? The Sumerians devised a clever workaround. Before sealing the bulla, they would press the tokens into its wet clay exterior, creating impressions that mirrored the shapes of the tokens hidden within. The marks on the outside were a perfect representation of the contents. And then, one day, an unknown Sumerian administrator must have paused, tablet in hand, and had a moment of profound, world-changing insight. If the marks on the outside of the bulla were a perfect symbol of the tokens inside, why were the tokens needed at all? Why not dispense with the cumbersome two-part system and simply inscribe the symbols directly onto a flattened piece of wet clay? It was a leap of abstraction that seems simple in retrospect, but it was the true birth of writing. The first words ever written were not poetry. They were not epic tales of heroes or profound philosophical insights. They were, in all likelihood, a receipt. They were marks in mud that said, 5 sheep, 10 bushels of barley, 3 jars of oil. They were the mundane records of a bustling, bureaucratic society. This nascent script is known to us as cuneiform, a name derived from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. The name comes from the primary tool used to write it, a stylus fashioned from a sharpened reed. When pressed into a soft clay tablet, the reed's triangular tip produced distinctive wedge-shaped marks. Initially, the system was purely pictographic. The symbol for a bird looked like a simple drawing of a bird. The symbol for a head of barley looked like a stalk of barley. But drawing detailed pictures for every single object in the world is incredibly slow and inefficient. Over centuries of use by busy scribes, these pictographs evolved. They became more abstract, more stylized, quicker to write. The drawing of an ox's head, turned on its side and simplified to a few quick strokes, became the abstract symbol for ox. More importantly, the script underwent a second, even more crucial transformation. The symbols began to represent not just the object they depicted, but the sound of the word for that object. This is the famous rebus principle, a concept familiar to us in children's puzzles. For example, the Sumerian word for barley was she. The symbol for barley could now be used to represent the phonetic sound she in a longer, more complex word that might have nothing to do with grain. The word for arrow was T. The symbol for an arrow could now be used to represent the concept of life, which was also pronounced T. This phonetic leap was the single most important development in the history of writing. It unshackled language from the concrete world of objects. Now abstract concepts, love, honor, justice, fear, divinity, could be given physical form on a clay tablet. Writing was no longer just a ledger for accountants. It was becoming a true extension of spoken language. The mastery of this complex system, which still contained hundreds of symbols, gave rise to a new and powerful social class, the scribe. Scribes were the intellectuals, the technologists, the civil servants of their day. They trained for years in special schools known as edubas, or tablet houses, enduring harsh discipline to master the intricate art of reading and writing. They were the memory of the state, the indispensable cogs in the machinery of government, religion, and commerce. They recorded the king's decrees, the temple's rituals, the general's orders, and the merchant's contracts. But they also began to write down the things that give a culture its soul. They inscribed the law codes, like that of Ur-Nammu, which predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by centuries. They chronicled the lists of kings, creating a tangible thread of history stretching back into the mythical past. And they recorded their people's deepest stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest and most profound works of literature, a stirring tale of friendship, the terror of mortality, and the desperate search for meaning, was preserved for millennia in these wedge-shaped marks on baked clay. Clay, when fired, becomes stone. It endures. For the first time in the human story, a thought, a law, or a poem could become immortal. As the Sumerian civilization gave way to the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, the technology of cuneiform writing on clay tablets spread throughout the Near East, adapted for many different languages. But it was not the only solution to the problem of permanence. Far to the west, another great civilization was rising along the fertile, life-giving banks of the Nile River. The Egyptians, insulated by deserts and sea, developed their own unique and arguably more beautiful system of writing, hieroglyphics. Unlike the abstract, utilitarian wedges of cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs retained their pictorial nature. They were a vibrant and complex menagerie of animals, birds, gods, and everyday objects. This was a sacred script which the Egyptians called Medu Neter, or the words of the gods. It was intended for monumental purposes, painstakingly carved into the stone walls of temples and the inner chambers of tombs, a holy language designed to communicate with the divine and to last for eternity. However, carving intricate images into solid rock is hardly a practical method for issuing a military order or recording a tax payment. For the daily administration of their vast and highly centralized kingdom, the scribes of Egypt needed a faster and more portable medium. They found the perfect solution growing in abundance in the marshy deltas of the Nile: the papyrus plant. The invention of papyrus as a writing surface was a work of simple genius. The stalk of the tall reed was harvested, and its tough green outer rind was peeled away. The soft, fibrous inner pith was then sliced into thin, ribbon-like strips. These strips were laid down on a flat surface in two layers, one overlapping layer oriented horizontally, and a second layer on top oriented vertically. This mat of fibers was then pressed under a heavy weight, and as it dried, the plant's natural sugary sap acted as a perfect adhesive, bonding the strips into a single, strong, flexible, and remarkably lightweight sheet. Multiple sheets could be glued together end to end to form a long scroll. The invention of papyrus was a quantum leap. For the first time in history, written information was truly portable. A pharaoh's decree issued from his palace in Memphis could be rolled up, tucked into a tube, and carried by a messenger to a remote garrison in Nubia, or an oasis in the western desert, to be read and enacted days later. The sprawling bureaucracy of the Egyptian state, perhaps the most efficient and organized of the ancient world, was built quite literally on these rolls of processed reeds. Tax records, census data, legal documents, and military dispatches could now be easily created, transported, and archived. This new medium also necessitated new tools. The sharp reed stylus used for impressing clay was useless here. It was replaced by a softer reed brush, or a pen made by chewing the end of a reed to separate its fibers. The ink was a simple but effective mixture of carbon black soot scraped from cooking pots or ground red ochre, mixed with water and a binding agent like plant gum to prevent it from running. This new fluid way of writing with brush and ink on a smooth surface encouraged the development of faster, more cursive scripts. Alongside the formal hieroglyphs, Egyptian scribes developed hieratic, a simplified joined-up script that was quicker to write and used for religious and official texts. Later still, an even faster script known as demotic, the people's writing, emerged for everyday use in business and private letters. The medium was actively shaping the evolution of the message. The existence of papyrus had a profound, if subtle, influence on the Egyptian worldview. While Mesopotamian cuneiform baked into immutable clay tablets gives its literature a sense of permanence and sometimes grim fatalism, the lightweight, disposable, and replaceable nature of papyrus scrolls may have complemented the Egyptian focus on cycles: the cycle of the Nile's flood and retreat, the cycle of the sun god Ra's journey across the sky, and the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. A clay tablet is final. A papyrus scroll can be rolled up, stored away, edited, or even scraped clean and reused. Yet, for all their world-changing power, both clay and papyrus had significant drawbacks. Clay tablets are heavy, bulky, and catastrophically fragile if dropped. Papyrus, while revolutionary, is vulnerable to moisture and decay, and it could only be cultivated in the unique climate of the Nile Delta. This gave Egypt a lucrative and powerful monopoly on the ancient world's premier writing material. The rest of civilization needed a better, more durable, and more universally accessible medium for the written word. This need would drive the next great innovations, which would ultimately take writing from the exclusive hands of an elite scribal class and begin the long, slow process of delivering it to the masses. The next pivotal chapter in our story was written not by the scribes of a great empire, but by the hard-nosed, practical merchants of the sea. The Phoenicians, based in a collection of city-states on the coast of modern-day Lebanon, were the master mariners and traders of the ancient Mediterranean. Their ships plied the waters from the shores of the Levant to the coasts of Africa and the Pillars of Hercules in Spain. As a culture defined by commerce, they had a pressing need for a simple, efficient, and easily learnable system of record-keeping. Their merchants, agents, and captains needed to be able to quickly jot down inventories, IOUs, and contracts in a dozen different ports, often with people who spoke a dozen different languages. The hundreds of complex symbols of cuneiform or hieroglyphics were far too cumbersome for this fast-paced international environment. Drawing upon generations of exposure to Egyptian and Mesopotamian writing systems, the Phoenicians developed, around 1200 BCE, a solution of radical simplicity, the alphabet. Their insight was as brilliant as it was pragmatic. Instead of using a symbol to represent a whole word or a complex syllable, they created a small, manageable set of symbols, just 22 of them, where each character represented a single basic consonant sound of their spoken language. Any word, no matter how complex, could be constructed by combining these simple phonetic building blocks. It was a system based not on what a thing is, but on what it sounds like. A merchant from Tyre no longer needed to spend years in a scribal school memorizing a vast and complex library of pictograms. He only needed to learn 22 letters and the sounds they represented. This was arguably the single most democratizing invention in human history. It shattered the monopoly on knowledge held by the priestly and bureaucratic classes. For the first time, literacy was within reach of the common person. It became a tool not just for the state, but for the individual. The Greeks, a burgeoning civilization of island hoppers and traders themselves, were in constant contact with the Phoenicians and quickly saw the immense power of their alphabetic system. Around the 8th century BCE, they adopted the Phoenician alphabet for their own language, but they made one crucial final improvement. The Phoenician script, like other Semitic writing systems, consisted only of consonants. The reader was expected to infer the correct vowel sounds from the context of the sentence. This works well for Semitic languages, but it is ill-suited to an Indo-European language like Greek, where vowels are critical to meaning. The Greeks, in a stroke of genius, took several of the Phoenician consonant symbols, for which they had no corresponding sound in their own language, and repurposed them to represent vowel sounds: alpha, epsilon, iota, omicron, upsilon. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The result was the world's first true alphabet, a system where every distinct sound of the spoken language, both consonant and vowel, had its own unique written character. The effect was explosive. This new, simple, and unambiguous writing system fueled the cultural flowering of ancient Greece. The profound philosophical inquiries of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the timeless dramatic plays of Sophocles and Euripides, the foundational historical accounts of Herodotus and Thucydides, all were made possible and were able to be preserved and widely distributed because of an alphabet that was easy to learn, write, and read. It was the bedrock of Athenian democracy, where laws had to be written down and displayed in the public square, the agora, for all literate citizens to read, debate, and understand. A citizen could now engage directly with the law and the workings of his government, rather than simply receiving it as a decree from on high. This perfected alphabet was passed from the Greeks to the Etruscans in Italy, and then to the Romans, who honed it into the elegant Latin alphabet that now dominates the Western world. Even with this near-perfect software of a simple alphabet, the hardware, the physical writing surface, remained a bottleneck. Papyrus was still the best option, but it was expensive, and its supply was jealously controlled by the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. The Romans, ever practical, made extensive use of a cheaper reusable alternative: wooden tablets coated with a thin layer of blackened beeswax. A pointed metal or bone stylus was used to scratch letters into the soft wax. The other end of the stylus was flattened and spatulate, so it could be used to smooth over the wax, effectively erasing the message. These wax tablets were the notebooks and blackboards of the ancient world, used for everything from a child's school lessons and a housewife's shopping list to a poet's rough drafts and a lawyer's courtroom notes. They were wonderfully convenient for temporary messages, but they were not suitable for creating a permanent, lasting work of literature or philosophy. A more durable solution emerged from a story of ancient geopolitical rivalry. The city of Pergamum, in modern-day Turkey, had built a library that was beginning to rival the great library of Alexandria in Egypt. According to the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, the Egyptian pharaoh, in a fit of jealous pique, embargoed the export of papyrus to Pergamum to stifle its cultural growth. Cut off from the world's primary source of writing material, the scholars of Pergamum were forced to innovate. They perfected a writing surface that had been in limited use for some time: parchment. Made from the specially treated skins of animals, most commonly sheep, goats, or calves. Parchment was a superior material in almost every way. The manufacturing process was laborious and unpleasant. The animal skin had to be de-haired in a lime bath, scraped clean of all flesh and fat, stretched taut on a large wooden frame, and then scraped again with a crescent-shaped knife until it was uniformly thin. The result was an incredibly durable, smooth, and long-lasting writing surface. It was more expensive than papyrus, but it was stronger, could be made anywhere there were herds of animals, and critically it could be written on both sides. The invention of parchment also led directly to a fundamental shift in the physical form of knowledge itself, the birth of the modern book. The scroll, the standard format for texts written on papyrus, is inherently clumsy. To find a specific passage, one must unroll the entire lengthy document. To cross-reference between two different scrolls is a juggling act requiring a large table and 4 hands. Parchment, however, was stiffer and could be folded. The Romans began to fold large sheets of parchment and sew them together along the fold, binding them between 2 wooden covers. They called this new format a codex. Initially, the codex was seen as a less formal, lower-status format than the prestigious scroll used for notes and account books, but its practical advantages were overwhelming. A codex was compact, far more portable than a bundle of scrolls, and it allowed for what we now call random access. A reader could instantly flip to any page, making it vastly easier to study, compare different passages, and navigate a lengthy text. The early Christians, a religion that relied heavily on the study and citation of its sacred texts, enthusiastically adopted the Codex for the Gospels and the letters of Paul. It was a more practical format for itinerant preachers carrying their holy books from town to town, and for congregations to quickly find and read passages during services. The eventual triumph of the Codex over the scroll during the late Roman Empire was a quiet but momentous revolution. As the Roman Empire crumbled in the West, the fragile flame of literacy and ancient knowledge was kept alive in the isolated monasteries of Europe. In their scriptoriums or writing rooms, monks would dedicate their lives to the painstaking, prayerful work of copying texts. By the dim light of a candle or a high window, they would spend countless hours hunched over slanted desks, meticulously copying the words of the past onto expensive pages of parchment, 1 letter at a time. They copied the scriptures, of course, but they also copied the Latin works of Virgil, Cicero, and Ovid, and the Greek philosophies of Aristotle that had been preserved in the Eastern Roman Empire. They were not merely scribes, they were the librarians for the future of humanity, the sole guardians of a thread of civilization that had worn terrifyingly thin. Without their quiet, anonymous labor, a vast portion of the intellectual heritage of the classical world would have vanished forever into the darkness. But parchment, for all its durability, was fantastically expensive. A single large Bible, like the Codex Amiatinus, could require the skins of more than 500 calves. Books were treasures, luxury items accessible only to the highest echelons of the church and the nobility. For literacy to truly become widespread, a final, decisive invention was needed. It would not come from the West, but from the distant East. It was an invention that would ultimately make knowledge cheap, plentiful, and unstoppable. It was paper. The perfection of the paper-making process is traditionally credited to a court official of the Han dynasty in China named Kai Lun, around the year 1005 CE. While cruder forms of paper-like material made from hemp may have existed for a century or 2 prior, it was Kai Lun who refined and standardized the technique. He created a pulp from a mixture of materials like mulberry bark, hemp fibers, old linen rags, and fishing nets. This mixture was boiled and beaten into a mushy slurry. A fine screen, likely made of woven fabric stretched on a bamboo frame, was then dipped into the vat of slurry, lifting out a thin, matted layer of intertwined fibers. This delicate layer was then pressed to remove excess water, dried in the sun, and carefully peeled off the screen as a finished sheet of paper. It was a process of almost magical efficiency. The resulting material was lightweight, absorbed ink beautifully, and most importantly, could be mass-produced from cheap, common materials. For centuries, the art of paper-making was a closely guarded state secret in China. It fueled a golden age of literature, art, and bureaucratic efficiency that far surpassed anything in the contemporary West. Knowledge became affordable. Books were no longer priceless treasures. The Chinese state could administer its vast territory with a highly educated class of scholar officials chosen through a sophisticated system of written examinations. But in history, secrets rarely last forever. The vehicle for its transmission to the West was warfare. In the year 751 CE, at the Battle of Talas River, on the border of modern-day Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, the armies of the expanding Abbasid Caliphate decisively defeated the forces of China's Tang dynasty. Among the prisoners of war captured by the victorious Arabs were a number of skilled Chinese papermakers. The secret was out. The technology was quickly carried back to the heart of the Islamic world. Papermaking workshops, the first outside of China, were established in the great city of Samarkand, and soon after in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo. The arrival of this cheap, abundant writing material helped to ignite the Islamic Golden Age, a period of extraordinary scientific, mathematical, and philosophical achievement. Paper mills across the Arab world churned out endless supplies of paper, fueling a vibrant intellectual culture. Scholars in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad translated the great works of the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, which had been preserved in parchment codices by the monks of Byzantium and the Syriac Christians, into Arabic. They then added their own immense contributions in fields like medicine, optics, algebra, and astronomy. It was all recorded on paper. From the Islamic world, paper finally made its way into Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries, introduced by the Moors through Spain and by trade with Sicily. Initially, Europeans viewed this new material with suspicion. It felt flimsy and fragile compared to the sturdy, time-honored animal parchment, and it was sometimes dismissed as a pagan material from the Saracens. But its economic advantages were simply too profound to ignore. By the 14th century, water-powered paper mills were operating in Italy and Germany, and paper was rapidly replacing parchment for all but the most luxurious of documents. Its arrival could not have been more timely. It set the stage for the final explosive revolution in this long story. When, in the 1440s, a goldsmith in Mainz, Germany named Johannes Gutenberg combined the technology of cheap paper with his invention of movable metal type, the world was irrevocably changed. The printing press made the mass production of knowledge not just possible, but inevitable. From a humble clay receipt in Sumer to a mass-produced book in Renaissance Germany, the journey of the written word is the story of civilization's operating system. It is the technology that allows a human mind to speak with clarity and authority across 10,000 years. It is the technology that allows a complex idea to circle the globe and a single law to bind millions of people together. It freed our species from the eternal, recurring prison of the present moment, and gave us a past, a history. It is the silent, fundamental invention upon which every other innovation we will discuss tonight was built, recorded, refined, and passed on. If the written word gave humanity a memory that could conquer time, then engineering gave it a physical body, a tangible presence capable of reshaping the very planet. It is the grand, audacious art of bending the stubborn realities of stone, water, and gravity to the commands of the human will. We look upon our modern world, a landscape of steel and glass canyons, of bridges that leap across miles of open water, of tunnels that pierce the hearts of mountains, and we see the products of an almost magical power, born of computer-aided design, advanced metallurgy, and colossal mechanized tools. But these are merely the latest sentences in a story that began thousands of years ago. It is a story of humanity's persistent, defiant refusal to accept the world as it was found. The ancient engineers, the true pioneers, were not armed with lasers and dynamite. Their tools were humble things of copper, bronze, and stone. Their power sources were the straining muscles of men and beasts, and their greatest, most inexhaustible resource was the sheer force of human ingenuity. They faced the fundamental challenges of immense weight, vast distance, and the chaotic violence of nature, and through breathtaking organization and intellectual perseverance, they built the impossible. Their work was never merely construction, it was a declaration, written in letters of stone and earth, that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. Our first stop on this journey into monumental ambition takes us to a place so iconic, so shrouded in mystery and endurance, that its very name has become a synonym for the eternal: the Giza Plateau in Egypt. Here, under the serene and ancient gaze of the Great Sphinx, stand the three Great Pyramids, the sole surviving wonder of the ancient world. Their scale is so inhuman, their geometry so flawless, that for centuries they have invited fantastic explanations: lost continents, forgotten super technologies, extraterrestrial architects. But to indulge in these fantasies is to rob the pyramids of their true wonder. The miracle of Giza is not that it was built by some unknowable power, but that it was conceived and constructed by human beings. They are a monument not to magic, but to the phenomenal power of human organization, mathematical genius, and sheer, unyielding collective effort. They were designed as tombs for kings, but they are the eternal legacy of an entire nation. Let us try to place ourselves in the minds of the architects and project managers of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, around the year 2560 BCE. The royal command was to construct a structure that would be the largest, heaviest, and most precisely aligned building in the history of the world. It was to be a literal man-made mountain of stone, a perfectly designed resurrection machine to launch the soul of the divine pharaoh into the heavens to join the circumpolar stars. The final structure would be comprised of an estimated 2.3 million individual blocks of stone. Most of these blocks weighed between 2 and 15 tons, the equivalent of a modern truck, while the colossal granite beams used to roof the king's chamber deep within the pyramid's heart weighed up to 80 tons apiece. All of this had to be quarried, transported, and lifted into place using tools no more technologically complex than soft copper chisels, heavy wooden mallets, and pounders made of dolerite, a hard, igneous rock used as a primitive but effective hammerstone. Iron was not yet known to the Egyptians. The first great problem was simply sourcing the material. The vast bulk of the pyramid's core is made from millions of tons of yellowish limestone that was, conveniently, quarried right there on the Giza Plateau. Even today, you can see the enormous scooped-out depressions that are the scars of this ancient industrial activity. The quarrying process itself was a masterpiece of patient ingenuity. The copper saws and chisels of the Egyptians were too soft to cleave through the limestone directly. Instead, workers would use these tools to painstakingly cut a series of channels and trenches into the bedrock, isolating a block on 5 of its 6 sides. They would then carve small slots along the bottom edge and hammer in dry wooden wedges. Water would be poured over these wedges. The wood absorbing the water would begin to swell with a slow, irresistible, and almost silent force. This organic pressure would do what no amount of direct striking could. It would split the block from the bedrock with a clean fracture. It was a technology that harnessed a simple law of physics to achieve a Herculean result. But this was only the beginning. The smooth, brilliant white Tura limestone required for the pyramid's gleaming outer casing, which would have made it shine like a jewel in the desert sun, had to be quarried from the hills on the opposite side of the Nile. And the truly immense granite monoliths for the internal chambers and sarcophagus had to be brought from the quarries of Aswan, a staggering 500 miles to the south. This presented the second great logistical nightmare: transportation. Moving an 80-ton block of granite, the weight of a modern diesel locomotive, across miles of desert and water seems an impossible task. The Egyptians solved it with a combination of brute strength and a brilliant understanding of physics. The quarried blocks were lashed to massive wooden sledges. To move them from the quarry to the riverbank, a path would be cleared and smoothed. We know from a famous painting in the tomb of Jehuti-Hotep that the Egyptians understood the power of lubrication. The painting depicts a colossal statue being hauled by nearly 200 men, while a single figure stands at the front of the sledge, methodically pouring a liquid, likely water, onto the sand in its path. Recent experiments by physicists have confirmed that adding the correct, precise amount of water to sand can reduce its friction by as much as half, transforming it from a dragging burden to a manageable surface. Once at the Nile, the blocks were loaded onto enormous barges, specially constructed from cedarwood and papyrus ropes, and floated downriver. These journeys were timed to coincide with the annual inundation of the Nile, when the water levels were at their highest and the journey would be at its smoothest and safest. Then came the final and most hotly debated challenge of all. How do you lift millions of blocks weighing thousands of tons in total to construct a solid stone mountain that would eventually rise to a height of nearly 500 feet? The frustrating truth is that we do not know for certain. The Egyptians, who recorded so much of their lives, left us no blueprints or diagrams of their precise construction methods. It remains one of the great secrets of the ancient world. But the leading theories all center on the ingenious and extensive use of ramps. The debate among Egyptologists is not whether ramps were used, but what form they took. The simplest theory proposes a long, straight external ramp, growing in length and height as the pyramid itself grew. The primary problem with this model is that to maintain a workable gradient of around 8%, the ramp would have had to be extended to a length of over a mile, eventually containing more material and requiring more labor than the pyramid itself. Other theories are more complex and perhaps more plausible. Some scholars propose a spiral ramp that corkscrewed around the outside of the pyramid as it rose, resting on the tiered core blocks. Others suggest a combination of a larger external ramp for the massive lower courses, with a more sophisticated internal ramp or system of levers being used for the lighter upper courses. This internal ramp theory has gained considerable traction in recent years after microgravity scans of the Great Pyramid detected a mysterious void, a spiral-shaped anomaly within the structure's interior. Whatever the precise method, the construction was a marvel of human organization. The workers were not, as the Greek historian Herodotus and later Hollywood films claimed, a mass of brutalized slaves. Archaeological excavations of the workers' village at Giza have revealed that the builders were a paid, well-fed, and highly organized national workforce. They were divided into crews and gangs with names like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. They were provided with daily rations of bread, beer, and meat. They had access to medical care, as evidenced by skeletons found with healed fractures and even evidence of brain surgery. For these Egyptians, building the pyramid was a national project and a sacred duty. It was a way of ensuring the stability of their entire cosmos, which was dependent on the successful journey of their divine king into the afterlife. And the precision they achieved is in some ways even more astonishing than the colossal scale of the project. The base of the Great Pyramid covers over 13 acres, but it is almost a perfect square. The length of its 4 sides varies by less than 6 centimeters. The entire foundation is level to within an inch. And most remarkably, the entire structure is aligned to the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy of within 1/15 of a single degree. How was this possible for a civilization without the aid of a magnetic compass, a telescope, or a laser theodolite? The alignment to true north was almost certainly achieved through meticulous astronomical observation. By tracking the rising and setting of a specific star in the northern sky, and bisecting the angle, Egyptian astronomers could find true north with phenomenal accuracy. The leveling of the vast foundation was likely accomplished by a simple but brilliant method, building a low mud wall around the perimeter, flooding the enclosed area with water, marking the uniform water level on the interior bedrock, and then cutting away all the rock above that line. The Great Pyramid is not just a big building, it is a masterpiece of applied mathematics and a physical embodiment of the Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the fundamental cosmic principle of order, truth, balance, and justice. It is engineering as a form of worship. Now, let us journey forward in time and across the waters of the Mediterranean, to an empire whose engineering genius was of a profoundly different, but no less impactful character, the Roman Empire. Where Egyptian engineering was monumental, religious, and focused on the eternity of the afterlife, Roman engineering was ruthlessly practical, civic-minded, and focused on the projection of imperial power in this life. And no single technology demonstrates this Roman ethos more clearly than their solution to one of the most fundamental problems of urban civilization, the supply of water. By the 1st century CE, the city of Rome had become the first metropolis in human history to reach a population of over 1 million people. It was a teeming, chaotic, and vibrant hub of commerce, culture, and power. But such a city cannot survive on the water from a local river like the Tiber, which was not only heavily polluted but also served as the city's primary sewer. A city of this size requires a constant, massive, and reliable supply of clean, fresh water for drinking, for public fountains, for flushing waste, and most famously, for the enormous and opulent public bathhouses that were the beating heart of Roman social life. The Roman answer to this challenge was the aqueduct. The core concept is deceptively simple. Find a clean water source, such as a spring or a mountain stream, that is located at a higher elevation than your city. Then construct an artificial channel that allows gravity and gravity alone to do all the work, carrying a steady stream of water, sometimes across dozens of miles of challenging terrain, into the urban centre. The execution of this simple concept, however, was a work of pure genius. Roman surveyors, the unsung heroes of this story, were masters of their craft, equipped with simple but remarkably effective tools. To establish a perfectly straight line over long distances, they used a device called a groma, which consisted of a vertical staff with a rotating horizontal crosspiece, from which 4 plumb lines were hung. By aligning the plumb lines, they could sight a straight path. To determine the correct gradient for the water channel, they relied on a chorobates. This was a long 20-foot wooden beam with legs at each end, and a groove carved into its top surface. By pouring water into this groove, they could establish a true horizontal with great accuracy, much like a modern spirit level. Using these tools, they would meticulously plot a course for the water that maintained a slow, gentle, but absolutely continuous downward slope. The ideal gradient was minuscule, often a drop of only a few inches for every 100 feet of length, a gradient of less than 1%. If the slope were too steep, the rushing water would erode the channel walls over time. If it were too shallow, the water would pool and stagnate, allowing sediment to build up and choke the flow. For most of their length, Roman aqueducts were not the beautiful, soaring bridges that we see on postcards. Over 80% of the aqueduct system consisted of simple, covered underground channels or tunnels, which followed the natural contour of the land where possible. This protected the water from contamination and evaporation, and was far cheaper to build. The famous and beautiful arch bridges were the Roman spectacular solution to the specific problem of crossing a deep valley or river. Building a massive earthen ramp or a siphon system was impractical and structurally risky. Instead, the Romans, who were the undisputed masters of the arch, would build magnificent arcades to carry the water channel across the obstacle at precisely the correct height. The Pont du Gard in southern France stands as the most breathtaking surviving example. Built around 19 BCE, it spans the Gardon River with 3 tiers of superimposed arches, reaching a height of over 160 feet. It is a structure of almost sublime beauty and grace, but for the Romans, its beauty was secondary to its function. Its main structure was built with precisely cut stones that were fitted together without any mortar. The sheer compressive force of the arches holds the entire bridge in place. The true secret weapon that underpinned all of Roman engineering, the revolutionary technology that made the aqueducts, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the great bathhouses possible, was their unique invention of concrete. Roman concrete, known as opus cementicium, was a material that changed the rules of architecture. Unlike modern Portland cement, the Romans created their mortar by mixing slaked lime, not with sand, but with a special type of volcanic ash known as pozzolana, named after the town of Pozzuoli near Mount Vesuvius, where rich deposits were first identified. When this pozzolana mortar was mixed with water and an aggregate of rubble or broken stones, it created a concrete of incredible strength, plasticity. Its true magic, however, lay in a peculiar chemical property of the pozzolana ash. It allowed the concrete to set and harden even in the absence of air, meaning it was hydraulic. It could set underwater. This was a complete game-changer for civil engineering. The Romans could now build solid bridge piers in the middle of fast-flowing rivers, durable harbour breakwaters that could withstand the battering of the sea, and waterproof foundations in marshy ground. Furthermore, concrete did not require the intensive labour of highly skilled stonemasons. It was a plastic material that could be poured by ordinary labourers into wooden forms and moulds, allowing the Romans to create shapes that were difficult or impossible to achieve with cut stone massive vaults, soaring domes like that of the Pantheon, and the endlessly repeating efficient arches of the aqueducts. It was cheap, it was versatile, and it was unbelievably strong. Sections of Roman harbours built with this concrete are still intact today, having spent 2,000 years submerged in corrosive saltwater. The 11 major aqueducts that supplied the city of Rome eventually delivered an estimated 1 billion litres of fresh water into the city every single day, more water per capita than many modern cities enjoy today. This water poured into enormous distribution centres called castella aquae, from which it was then funneled through a complex network of lead pipes to thousands of public fountains, the homes of the wealthy elite, and the colossal public baths. These baths, or thermae, were the engine of Roman social life, vast, state-funded complexes that offered not just bathing in hot, warm and cold pools, but also libraries, art galleries, gymnasiums and gardens. The aqueducts were the arteries of the Roman Empire, a life-giving system that enabled its cities to grow to an unprecedented size, promoting public health and sanitation, and providing a visible daily reminder to every citizen of the power, wealth and beneficence of Roman rule. They were a physical manifestation of the Roman genius for imposing order and structure upon the natural world. From the engineering of the sacred and the engineering of the civic, we now turn to the engineering of pure survival, on a scale so vast that it has become the stuff of legend. We travel east, to China, to a structure so sprawling it was long claimed to be the only man-made object visible from space. A popular myth, but one that speaks directly to its legendary scale. This is, of course, the Great Wall of China. It is crucial to understand that the Great Wall is not a single continuous barrier built at one time. Rather, it is a complex and sprawling system of fortifications, walls, watchtowers and fortresses, built, rebuilt, abandoned and extended by numerous different dynasties over a staggering period of more than 2,000 years. Its primary purpose was to address one of the most persistent and vexing geopolitical problems in history: the fundamental conflict between a sedentary, agricultural civilization and the mobile, nomadic peoples on its borders. For century after century, the fertile heartland of China was vulnerable to swift, devastating and unpredictable raids from the horse-riding tribes of the northern steppes, most famously the Shingun and later the Mongols. A conventional army of infantry was too slow to catch them. They could raid a province, seize grain and goods, and be gone, vanishing back into the vastness of the steppe before an effective response could be mustered. The Chinese solution was one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever conceived, to build a permanent, artificial frontier. The engineering of the wall is a masterclass in pragmatism and adaptation to the local environment. It is not one single type of construction, but a dozen, each one dictated by the specific challenges of the terrain and the materials available at hand. In the east, near the centers of Chinese power, the famous Ming Dynasty wall that tourists flock to see today is a formidable battlement of quarried stone and millions of kiln-fired grey bricks, filled with a core of earth and rubble, and wide enough in many places for several horsemen to ride abreast. But as the wall snakes its way westwards, into the arid, desolate landscapes of Gansu province and the forbidding Gobi Desert, the materials change completely. Here there are no great forests to provide fuel for firing bricks, and no mountains of solid granite to quarry. The engineers of the much earlier Han Dynasty, over 2,000 years ago, employed a technique of incredible ingenuity known as rammed earth. They would construct movable wooden frames, a kind of temporary shuttering, and fill them with thin, successive layers of the local soil, gravel, and sometimes interwoven willow reeds. Each layer, only a few inches thick, would then be pounded and compacted by a team of workers using heavy wooden rams until it was as dense and hard as soft rock. The wooden frame would then be detached, moved down the line, and the process repeated, section by section. The result was a wall of surprising strength and remarkable durability, built entirely from the dirt upon which it stood. Astonishingly, sections of this 2,000-year-old rammed earth wall still stand today, silently defying the harsh desert winds, a testament to the effectiveness of this seemingly primitive technique. But the true genius of the Great Wall was that it was never intended to be just a passive, static barrier. It was conceived and operated as a fully integrated, dynamic defense system. A military nerve network stretched across the entire northern frontier. Along its entire length, a series of fortified watchtowers were built within sight of one another. These towers served multiple functions. They were garrisons for troops, secure armories for weapons, and protected shelters from the harsh climate. But their most critical function was to serve as signal stations. A sophisticated and standardized code of signals was developed to relay information along the wall at astonishing speed. The number and combination of smoke puffs by day or of fires and lanterns by night could communicate not just the presence of an enemy force, but also its approximate size and location. One study has estimated that a message could travel from the first tower at the eastern end of the Ming Wall to the last, a distance of hundreds of miles, in just a few hours. This was a speed of communication that was utterly unmatched anywhere in the world until the invention of the electric telegraph more than 1,500 years later. The wall was in effect a colossal tripwire. Its purpose was not necessarily to stop a massive, determined invasion force, which it failed to do on several occasions. Its real purpose was to prevent small-scale attritional raiding, to control and channel all trade and movement through a few heavily fortified gates, and most critically, to provide an invaluable early warning system. It was a monumental military sense organ, allowing the central government in its distant capital to detect and react to a threat on its remote frontier with unprecedented speed. The pyramids of Giza, reaching for the heavens, were a physical prayer, an expression of a civilization's deepest convictions about life, death, and the structure of the cosmos. The aqueducts of Rome, a network of life-giving arteries, were a physical manifestation of a civilization's commitment to civic order, public well-being, and imperial administration. The Great Wall of China, a stone serpent writhing across a continent, was a pragmatic expression of a civilization's primal instinct for security and self-preservation. Each of these monumental undertakings solved a profoundly different kind of problem: theological, logistical, and military, but all three stand today as a testament to the same core human truth. They demonstrate, in the most powerful way imaginable, that the greatest tool any society possesses is the organized, collective power of human ingenuity. They show us that with enough will, enough time, and a clear enough purpose, there are few obstacles on this earth that we cannot in the end overcome. The ancient engineers did not just build structures of stone and dirt, they built the very foundations of the world we still inhabit. We have journeyed into the minds of scribes who conquered time and the engineers who conquered stone. But all of their achievements, all the pyramids, all the libraries, all the empires, rested upon a foundation far more fundamental and far more fragile: a surplus of food. Civilization is a house built on a full stomach. Before you can have a priest, a soldier, a king, or a poet, you must first have a farmer capable of feeding them. The story of agriculture is the story of the single most profound transformation in the human experience. It is the story of how we, as a species, went from being a wild animal, subject to the whims of nature, to becoming a shaper of ecosystems, a domesticator of life itself. The inventions in this story may seem humble: a sharpened stick, a curved blade, a special collar for an ox, but they are the technologies that allowed humanity to multiply, to settle, to build, and ultimately to thrive. This is the story of the tools that feed the world. Our narrative begins not with a tool of metal or wood, but with an idea so powerful it would spark the single greatest revolution our species has ever known. This was the Neolithic Revolution. For hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens had lived as wanderers, as hunters and gatherers, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the migrations of wild game. They were a part of the ecosystem, living within it, but not controlling it. Their populations were small, their communities nomadic, their possessions few. Their entire existence was a constant, restless search for the next meal. But then, beginning around 10,000 BCE, in the rolling hills of the Fertile Crescent in the Near East, a scattered collection of small human bands began a radical experiment. They started to intentionally cultivate specific plants: wild grasses like einkorn and emmer wheat, barley and lentils, and to manage and domesticate wild animals like goats, sheep and aurochs, the ancestors of modern cattle. It was not a sudden event. Not a single flash of insight, but a slow, halting process that unfolded over thousands of years. But its consequences were absolute and irreversible. It was the moment humanity made the decision to stop chasing its food and instead to create it. This shift from a nomadic to a sedentary lifestyle created a new set of problems that demanded new technological solutions. The first and most basic challenge was breaking the earth. Foraging requires little more than a digging stick to unearth a tuber, but farming requires preparing an entire field. The soil had to be loosened to allow seeds to germinate and roots to grow. The first tool to address this was the ard, or the scratch plough. It was, in its earliest form, little more than a sharpened, fire-hardened stick, sometimes tipped with stone, that was dragged through the topsoil by human strength. It did not turn the soil over as a modern plough does, it simply scratched a shallow furrow, a groove into which seeds could be planted. It was back-breaking, exhausting work, but it was a revolutionary leap. For the first time, a farmer could prepare more land than he could with a simple handheld hoe. The ard allowed for the expansion of cultivation, the first true fields, the attachment of a handle to guide it, and later, the hitching of the ard to a pair of domesticated oxen, represented a monumental step forward. By harnessing the power of animals, a single farmer could now cultivate a plot of land vastly larger than was possible with human muscle alone. This was the first application of non-human energy to agriculture, a partnership between man and beast that would define farming for the next 10,000 years. The scratch plough was simple, but it was effective enough to support the rise of the first great civilizations in the light, sandy soils of Mesopotamia and Egypt. But prepared soil is useless without water. In the arid river valleys where the first cities rose, rainfall was scarce and unreliable. The entire existence of these civilizations depended on their ability to manage the great rivers that flowed through their lands, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Nile. This necessity gave birth to the science of irrigation, the art of deliberately moving water from its source to the fields. In Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, this was a constant battle. The floods of the Tigris and Euphrates were violent and unpredictable, coming at the wrong time for the growing season. The Sumerians and later the Babylonians and Assyrians developed a complex system of canals, dikes, and levees. They dug miles of primary canals, diverting huge amounts of water from the rivers. From these, a web of smaller secondary and tertiary channels branched out, delivering water to individual fields. This was an immense undertaking, requiring the mobilization of thousands of laborers and a sophisticated understanding of hydrology and engineering. It also had profound social consequences. Building and maintaining such a system required a centralized authority, a priesthood or a king, to organize the labor, settle disputes over water rights, and manage the intricate distribution network. Many historians argue that the need for large-scale irrigation management was the primary driver behind the formation of the first state-level societies and the creation of the first law codes, many of which dealt explicitly with water theft and the responsibilities of farmers to maintain their section of the canal. Water in Mesopotamia was a source of life, but also a source of conflict and control. In Egypt, the problem was different. The Nile flood was in stark contrast to the Mesopotamian rivers, remarkably gentle and predictable, arriving like clockwork every year and depositing a fresh layer of rich, fertile silt. The Egyptian system of irrigation was therefore less about controlling violent floods and more about passively managing this annual gift. They developed what is known as basin irrigation. They would build a network of low earthen walls to divide the floodplain into a series of large basins. When the Nile rose, these basins would fill with water and silt. The water would be held there for several weeks, soaking deep into the soil, and then drained back into the river as the flood receded, leaving behind a perfectly watered and fertilized field ready for planting. It was an elegant and efficient system, but it limited farming to the narrow strip of the floodplain. To bring water to lands at a higher elevation, or to irrigate gardens and orchards during the dry season, the Egyptians invented one of the world's first lifting devices, the shadoof. It consisted of a long wooden pole, pivoted on a central post, with a heavy counterweight, usually a large lump of clay or stone on one end, and a bucket or skin bag on the other. A single operator could swing the pole down, dip the bucket into the river, and then let the counterweight do the work of lifting the full bucket of water, which could then be easily emptied into a small irrigation channel. A single shadoof could lift hundreds of gallons of water a day, dramatically expanding the amount of cultivable land and making year-round agriculture possible in some areas. A slightly more advanced device, the sakia or water wheel, was powered by domesticated animals like oxen or donkeys walking in a circle, turning a geared wheel that lifted a continuous chain of pots, bringing a much greater volume of water to the fields. These lifting machines, while simple, represented a crucial step in the intensification of farming, turning the Nile from a single annual event into a year-round resource. While these systems brought water to the crops, another humble yet vital invention ensured that the harvest itself could be gathered efficiently: the sickle. Initially, primitive farmers might have harvested their wild grains by simply beating the stalks or stripping the seeds by hand, a slow and wasteful process. The invention of the sickle, a curved blade with a short handle, changed everything. The earliest sickles found at Neolithic sites were made not of metal but of flint bladelets, painstakingly knapped and set into a wooden or bone handle using bitumen as an adhesive. The curve of the blade was an ergonomic innovation, allowing the reaper to grasp a bunch of grain stalks in one hand and swing the sickle at the base with the other, severing them in a single efficient motion. The development of bronze and later iron sickles made the blades more durable and able to hold a sharper edge, but the fundamental design remained unchanged for millennia. The sickle represents a perfect marriage of form and function. It concentrates the force of the swing along its curved edge, and its compact size allows for selective harvesting, enabling farmers to work around rocks or unripe patches of grain. It was this tool, repeated in the hands of millions of farmers, that brought the world's grain harvest home, year after year, forming the very foundation of the global food supply. As agriculture spread from the Near East into Europe, it encountered a new and formidable challenge: the soil itself. The light, arid soils of Mesopotamia were easily broken by the scratch plough, but the soils of northern Europe were heavy, wet, and dense with clay. The simple ard was almost useless here. It would either skate ineffectively over the surface, or get bogged down in the thick, sticky earth. For centuries, the vast, fertile forests of Germany, France, and Britain remained largely uncultivated, their immense agricultural potential locked away. The solution, which appeared in late antiquity and came into widespread use in the early Middle Ages, was a revolutionary new machine, the heavy mouldboard plough. This was not just an improvement on the ard, it was a completely different technology, designed not just to scratch the soil, but to systematically cut, lift, and turn it over. The heavy plough was a complex machine with three crucial interacting parts. First was the coulter, a vertically mounted knife that sliced down into the sod like a blade. Next came the ploughshare, a horizontal blade that cut the soil from below, severing the roots of the grasses and weeds. Finally, and most importantly, was the mouldboard, a curved wooden or metal plate located behind the ploughshare. The mouldboard's job was to catch the slice of earth cut by the coulter and share, lift it up, and turn it completely over. This action buried the surface weeds and grasses, which would then decompose and act as a natural fertilizer, and it brought the fresh, nutrient-rich soil from below up to the surface. The impact of the heavy plough was transformative. It was a tool of deforestation and colonization, allowing medieval farmers to clear the vast, dense forests of northern Europe and bring their rich, heavy soils under cultivation for the first time. Because the plough was so heavy and required so much force to pull, often needing a team of 6 or 8 oxen, it encouraged a new form of social organization. Individual peasants rarely owned a full team of 8 oxen, so villagers had to pool their resources, fostering a more communal approach to farming and land management. The long, narrow, rectangular fields that are still characteristic of much of the European landscape are a direct result of the difficulty of turning a heavy plough and its large team of oxen. It was far more efficient to plough in a long, straight line for as long as possible before making a turn. The ability of the mouldboard plough to turn and aerate the soil also dramatically improved drainage, a critical advantage in the damp climate of northern Europe. This led to significantly increased crop yields and underpinned the agricultural revolution of the Middle Ages. It enabled the widespread adoption of the three-field system of crop rotation, where 2 fields would be planted and 1 left fallow each year, a much more productive system than the old 2-field rotation. This agricultural surplus fueled a dramatic rise in population, the growth of towns and cities, the financing of crusades, and the emergence of the great Gothic cathedrals and powerful kingdoms of high medieval Europe. Not all landscapes, however, are flat plains or rolling hills suitable for ploughing. In the mountainous regions of the world, from the Andes of South America to the hillsides of the Philippines and Japan, farmers faced the dual challenge of cultivating steep, unstable slopes and managing precious water resources. Their solution was an engineering marvel that combined agriculture with hydraulics, terrace farming. Terracing is the practice of building a series of stepped, level platforms into the side of a hill or mountain. Each terrace is essentially a small, flat field, held in place by a retaining wall, which could be made of stone or packed earth. The genius of this system is multifold. First, it creates level, arable land for planting where none existed. Second, and most critically, it solves the devastating problems of water runoff and soil erosion. Instead of flowing rapidly down the slope, carrying away the precious topsoil, rainwater is captured by each terrace, allowing it to soak slowly into the ground, providing a consistent source of moisture for the crops. In sophisticated systems like those built by the Inca in the Andes or the rice farmers of Asia, intricate stone or bamboo channels would connect the terraces, allowing farmers to precisely manage the flow of irrigation water from the top of the mountain to the bottom, feeding each paddy in succession. The Incan terraces, or andins, were particularly advanced examples of this technology. The retaining walls were often built with a slight inward batter, a subtle angle that made them more stable and resistant to the frequent earthquakes of the region. The terraces themselves were not just filled with local dirt, they were a complex, layered system designed for maximum productivity. The bottom layer typically consisted of coarse gravel for excellent drainage, preventing waterlogging. This was followed by a middle layer of sand and soil, and finally topped with a thick layer of rich, dark topsoil that had been laboriously carried up from the more fertile valley floors. This sophisticated construction allowed the Inca to create distinct microclimates on each level, growing different crops like potatoes, maize, and quinoa at different altitudes, perfectly suited to the specific conditions. They turned steep, inhospitable mountainsides into a vibrant, highly productive, and sustainable agricultural landscape that could support the vast and powerful Inca Empire. Similarly, the breathtaking rice terraces of Banaway in the Philippines, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, are a 2,000-year-old system of irrigated paddies carved into the mountainsides, a living monument to a deep, generational understanding of hydrology and earthworks. Terrace farming represents a unique form of landscape architecture, a way of working with the challenges of the terrain rather than trying to flatten it, a harmonious fusion of human ingenuity and the natural world. Of course, the effectiveness of any plough or field system was only as good as the power source that drove it. For millennia, the primary source of agricultural power was the ox. Oxen are strong, they are steady, they are docile, and they are easy to feed on simple forage. But they are also incredibly slow. The horse, an animal with far more speed and endurance, was for a long time a frustratingly inefficient plough animal. The reason lay not with the animal, but in the design of its harness. The ancient throat and girth harness, which worked adequately for the bony high shoulders of an ox, was disastrously ill-suited for the anatomy of a horse. The main strap passed directly across the front of the horse's neck. When the horse began to pull a heavy load, the harness would press against its windpipe and carotid artery, literally choking the animal and severely restricting its ability to breathe and pull with its full force. A horse in this type of harness could only apply a fraction of its true potential strength, making it little better than an ox and far more expensive to feed. The solution, which was developed in China as early as the 5th century AD and slowly made its way along the trade routes to arrive in Europe several centuries later, was the horse collar. This was a padded, rigid collar that was designed to rest on the horse's strong, muscular shoulders, completely avoiding any pressure on the windpipe. This simple but brilliant innovation allowed the animal to push forward with the full strength of its hindquarters and body weight. The horse collar was, without exaggeration, one of the most important inventions of the Middle Ages. Combined with the use of iron horseshoes, another innovation which protected the horse's softer hooves from the damp and rocky European soils, the horse collar effectively quadrupled the amount of useful power a single horse could provide. Furthermore, a horse is roughly 50% faster than an ox. The gradual transition from ox power to horsepower in European agriculture had a profound ripple effect across the entire economy. It meant that fields could be ploughed in half the time, or that a single farming family could manage a much larger area of land. This dramatic increase in speed and efficiency led to greater food production. It also meant that food could be transported from the countryside to the burgeoning towns and cities more quickly and cheaply, reducing spoilage and fostering urban growth. It freed up human labor for other tasks, from crafts and trades to military service. The sight of the powerful, collar-harnessed horse pulling the heavy moldboard plough through the thick soils of northern Europe was the site of a new and dynamic civilization on the rise, powered by a technology that finally unlocked the full potential of this noble animal. Once the grain was harvested, the final, crucial, and incredibly laborious task remained: turning the hard, inedible kernels into edible flour. For tens of thousands of years, this was accomplished through sheer human drudgery. The earliest method was the simple saddle quern, a flat or slightly concave stone on which a smaller, handheld stone, called a rubber, was rubbed back and forth. This process was slow, inefficient, and ergonomically punishing, requiring hours of back-breaking labor every single day, a task that overwhelmingly fell to the women of the household. Skeletal remains from Neolithic communities often show evidence of deformed kneecaps and arthritic toes, a direct result of spending hours kneeling and grinding grain. The development of the rotary quern, or mola manuaria, around the 5th century BCE in the Mediterranean world, was a significant improvement. This device consisted of two circular stones, one on top of the other. The upper stone, or runner stone, had a handle and a central hole where grain was poured. As the upper stone was turned, it ground the grain against the stationary lower bedstone, and the resulting flour was pushed out from between the edges. It was still manually operated, but its circular motion was far more ergonomic and efficient than the back-and-forth motion of the saddle quern. The true liberation from this daily grind, however, came with the harnessing of a new power source: water. The watermill, first described by the Roman engineer Vitruvius in the 1st century BCE, was a truly revolutionary machine. In a typical design, a stream or river was diverted into a channel, or mill race, to flow over or under a large water wheel. This wheel was then connected through a system of gears to a large, heavy millstone. The gears were the secret to the machine's success. They were a work of brilliant mechanical engineering, translating the slow, heavy vertical rotation of the water wheel into the fast, powerful horizontal rotation needed to grind grain efficiently. A single Roman watermill, like the one excavated at Barbegal in southern France, a massive industrial complex of 16 interconnected wheels built into a hillside, could grind an estimated 28 tons of flour a day, enough to feed the entire nearby city of Arles. After the fall of Rome, the technology of watermills was preserved and greatly expanded upon by Cistercian monasteries and medieval lords. By the time of the Domesday Book survey in England in 1086, there were nearly 6,000 watermills recorded, one for every 50 households. This represents a staggering investment in public infrastructure and a profound shift in the labor economy. The tireless energy of the river had replaced the finite energy of human arms, freeing up millions of hours of labor for other, more productive tasks. In the later Middle Ages, in lands where flowing water was scarce, like the flat plains of Holland or the coasts of Spain, the windmill was adapted from designs seen in Persia and the Arab world, harnessing the power of the wind to perform the same essential task, becoming an iconic feature of the landscape. These mills didn't just grind grain, they were adapted to saw wood, press oil, and pump water, becoming the powerhouses of the pre-industrial world, from a simple digging stick to a wind-powered factory for producing flour. The technologies of agriculture are what made our world possible. They are not as glamorous as a pyramid, nor as intellectually refined as a written language, but they are infinitely more essential: the invention of the plough, the development of irrigation, the engineering of terraces, the harnessing of animal and natural power. These were the innovations that created the food surplus that is the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite for civilization. This surplus freed a portion of the population from the daily toil of producing food, allowing them to become artisans, soldiers, priests, merchants, and kings. It fueled population growth, enabled the rise of cities, and provided the economic engine for the construction of empires. Every bite of food we eat today is the end product of a 10,000-year-long chain of human ingenuity, a legacy of the forgotten farmers and inventors who figured out how to nurture the soil, control the water, and feed the world. There is a dark and violent thread woven through the tapestry of human history. It is the story of conflict, of the organized application of violence by one group against another. It is the story of war. For as long as we have built cities, we have built walls to protect them. For as long as we have accumulated wealth, we have forged weapons to defend it and to take it from others. To study the history of warfare is to study humanity in its most extreme state, a crucible where courage and cruelty exist in equal measure. But it is also to study a powerful and relentless engine of technological innovation. The forge of war has, time and again, acted as a grim catalyst, accelerating the development of new materials, new engineering principles, and new forms of social organization. The spear that fells an enemy and the plough that tills a field are two sides of the same coin of human ingenuity, born from the same mines and forged in the same smithies. The technologies of war are not just tools of destruction, they are artifacts that reveal the deepest fears, the highest ambitions, and the ruthless pragmatism of the civilizations that created them. Our story begins in an age of heroes and epic poems, an era defined by a revolutionary new material that glittered in the sun and rang with a deadly new sound on the battlefield: bronze. The Bronze Age, beginning roughly around 3300 BCE, represents a pivotal moment in the history of technology. For millennia, weapons had been made of stone, wood, and bone, materials that could shatter, splinter, or grow dull with use. The discovery that mixing a small amount of tin, typically around 10%, with common copper created a metal alloy that was far harder, more durable, and capable of holding a much sharper edge than either of its components, was a revelation. This was not a simple process. It required geological knowledge to locate and mine the disparate ores, complex trade networks to bring them together, as copper and tin are rarely found in the same place, sophisticated pyrotechnology to achieve the high temperatures needed for smelting, and skilled artisans to master the difficult art of casting the molten metal into molds. Bronze was not a democratic material. It was expensive, a metal of kings and elites, and its first and most dramatic application was in the creation of a new generation of deadly weaponry: keen-edged swords that could slash and thrust without breaking, durable helmets and breastplates that could turn aside a blow, and sharp spearheads that could pierce the hide shields and leather armor of a previous age. But the quintessential weapon system of the Bronze Age, the technology that dominated the great battlefields of the Near East and beyond for over 1,000 years, was not a single object, but a complex and terrifying combination of innovations: the war chariot. Appearing on the plains of the Near East and the steppes of Eurasia around 2000 BCE, the chariot was the ancient world's equivalent of a tank or a fighter jet, a symbol of power, status, and terrifying military might. It was a masterpiece of engineering, requiring the convergence of several advanced technologies to function. The first was advanced woodworking. Chariots had to be both incredibly strong to withstand the jolting and chaos of a battlefield, and incredibly lightweight to be pulled at high speed by a team of horses. This delicate balance was achieved through the revolutionary invention of the spoked wheel. Earlier solid or disc wheels were far too heavy and cumbersome for a war machine intended for speed. The spoked wheel, with its light wooden rim and central hub connected by a series of thin, taut spokes held in tension, dramatically reduced the weight while maintaining structural strength. This allowed for unprecedented speed and maneuverability. Chariot construction itself was a high art, often using bentwood technology, where wood was steamed and curved to create a light but resilient U-shaped frame with a floor of woven leather thongs to act as a primitive but effective shock absorber for the crew. The second necessary technology was animal husbandry. The horses of this era were not the large draft animals of the later Middle Ages. They were smaller, more like ponies, and had only recently been domesticated. Transforming them into engines of war required selective breeding programs to favor speed, stamina, and a temperament suited to the chaos of battle. It also spurred the development of sophisticated harnesses and bronze bits to allow the driver to control the animals effectively at a full gallop. Finally, the third key technology was archery. The early chariot was not primarily a shock weapon designed to crash into enemy formations like a battering ram. Instead, it was a mobile firing platform, a way to bring missile power to bear with unprecedented speed and flexibility. The warrior standing beside the driver was typically an aristocrat, armed with the most powerful ranged weapon of the day, the composite bow. Unlike a simple wooden self-bow, the composite bow was a complex laminate of different materials: a wooden core, a layer of animal horn on the belly, the side facing the archer, and a layer of sinew on the back, the side facing away, all held together with animal glue. The horn, which is strong under compression, and the sinew, which is strong under tension, work together to store a tremendous amount of energy when drawn. A Bronze Age composite bow could fire an arrow with enough force to pierce the bronze-scale armor of an enemy chariot warrior from hundreds of feet away. The result of this synthesis of technologies was a weapon of terrifying effectiveness. A squadron of chariots could sweep across the battlefield at high speed, acting as a screen for their own infantry, or they could race along the flanks of an enemy formation, peppering them with hails of arrows, sowing chaos and confusion without ever engaging in close-quarters combat. The Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE between the Egyptian Empire of Ramesses II and the Hittite Empire, was the largest chariot battle ever recorded, involving an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 of these war machines. It was a swirling, chaotic melee of high-speed platforms, a testament to the fact that for nearly 1,000 years the chariot was the undisputed king of the battlefield, a weapon that only the wealthiest and most technologically advanced empires could field. But the age of bronze and chariots was an age of aristocratic warfare, fought between small, elite corps of wealthy warriors. The next great technological shift would change all that. It would bring war to the masses. This was the discovery of iron. Iron ore is one of the most common elements on Earth, far more abundant than the relatively scarce tin required to make bronze. The challenge was entirely metallurgical. Smelting iron requires much higher temperatures than bronze, temperatures that were at the very edge of what ancient kilns could produce. Furthermore, the resulting bloom of raw iron is a spongy, porous mass full of slag and impurities that must be painstakingly and repeatedly heated and hammered out by a blacksmith. For centuries, iron was considered an inferior decorative metal, but as smiths gradually perfected the techniques of working it, and crucially discovered the secrets of steel-making, its true potential was unlocked. They learned that by hammering the iron bloom, they could consolidate it. By repeatedly folding it, they could create a kind of lamination, and through carburizing, heating the iron in a charcoal-rich environment to absorb carbon into its surface, and quenching, rapidly cooling the hot metal in water or oil to lock in a hard crystalline structure, they could create a material that was not only as good as bronze, but in many ways superior. It was tougher, less brittle, and could hold a sharp edge for longer. Most importantly, it was cheap. An iron sword or spearhead was affordable for an ordinary citizen soldier. This democratization of metal had a profound impact on the very nature of warfare. The era of the chariot-riding nobleman was over. The era of the common infantryman had begun. Nowhere is this shift more evident than in the rocky city-states of ancient Greece. Around the 7th century BCE, a new form of warfare emerged, centered on a new type of soldier, the hoplite. The hoplite was a heavily armored infantryman, a walking tank equipped with a full panoply of iron and bronze gear. He wore a bronze Corinthian helmet that covered his entire head, a bronze cuirass or breastplate, and bronze greaves to protect his shins. His primary weapon was a long 8 to 9 foot spear, the dory, tipped with a sharp iron leaf-shaped point, and featuring a bronze butt spike called a sorata, that could be used to finish off fallen enemies, or to anchor the spear in the ground. He also carried a short, iron sword, the Zikphos, for the brutal close-in fighting that ensued if the spear broke. But the single most important piece of hoplite technology, the item that defined his tactics, his social standing and his role in society, was his shield, the aspis. The aspis was a large circular shield, about 3 feet in diameter, constructed from planks of wood and covered with a thin layer of gleaming bronze. Its revolutionary feature was its double grip. Instead of a single central handle, the aspis had a bronze loop, the porpax, in the center for the forearm to pass through, and a leather hand grip, the antilabe, near the rim. This grip distributed the shield's considerable weight, up to 20 pounds, across the entire forearm and shoulder, making it much more stable and easier to control in a tight press. This unique shield design directly dictated the way hoplites fought. Because the grip was off-center, the left side of the shield protected the bearer, while the right side extended outwards, covering the vulnerable left flank of the man standing next to him. This simple fact necessitated the creation of one of history's most iconic military formations, the phalanx. The phalanx was a dense block of hoplites, typically 8 ranks deep and hundreds of men wide, where each man's shield protected his neighbor, creating an overlapping wall of bronze. The front ranks would present a solid hedge of iron-tipped spears. A phalanx advancing on a battlefield was a terrifying sight, an inexorable grinding machine of flesh and metal. It was almost invincible from the front, but slow-moving and extremely vulnerable on its flanks and rear. This meant that phalanx warfare was often a brutal, head-on shoving match, an orthismos, or push, where discipline, weight and cohesion were far more important than individual acts of heroism. The success of the phalanx depended on every soldier holding his position, trusting the man next to him to protect him. This shared vulnerability and mutual dependence fostered an intense camaraderie. Since each hoplite had to provide his own expensive equipment, the phalanx was made up of the middle-class, property-owning citizens of the polis. Their military service was directly linked to their political rights. The phalanx, therefore, was not just a military formation, it was the embodiment of the Greek city-state, a citizen army where military and political responsibility were one and the same. The Romans, in their inexorable rise from a single city to dominate the entire Mediterranean world, took the concept of heavy infantry and refined it into the most effective and versatile military machine of the ancient world, the legion. Where the Greek phalanx was rigid, monolithic, and best suited for flat, open terrain, the Roman legion was flexible, adaptable, and ruthlessly efficient. It was organized not into one massive block, but into smaller, more maneuverable tactical units called maniples, and later cohorts which could operate independently. The technology of the individual legionary was a masterpiece of practical, deadly design, perfected over centuries of constant warfare. His primary shield, the scutum, was a large, curved, rectangular shield, made of layers of wood glued together in a cross-grain pattern, and often faced with linen and leather, and edged with iron or bronze. Its curved shape offered superior protection, deflecting sword blows and missiles, while its large size allowed a legionary to shelter his entire body. It was this shield that enabled the famous testudo, or tortoise formation, where legionaries would overlap their shields on the front and above their heads, creating a nearly impenetrable armored shell against enemy projectiles. The legionary's offensive weaponry was a deadly and systematic 2-part system. His main weapon was not the spear but the pilum, a heavy javelin designed with fiendish ingenuity. The pilum was about 6 feet long, with a wooden shaft attached to a long, thin iron shank that sat behind its hardened pyramid-shaped point. This design had 2 devastating effects. First, its weight and shape gave it tremendous armor-piercing capability when thrown at close range. Second, the soft iron of the shank was designed to bend upon impact. This meant that once it hit an enemy's shield, it could not be pulled out and thrown back. The bent shank would hang from the enemy's shield, its weight and length making the shield impossibly awkward and heavy. This forced the enemy soldier to discard his primary piece of defensive equipment, leaving him exposed for the second part of the Roman attack. After hurling their pilum, the legionaries would draw their swords and charge into the disordered enemy ranks. The Roman sword, the gladius hispaniensis, was a short, broad, 2-edged blade, designed not for elegant slashing, but for brutal, efficient, close-quarters stabbing and thrusting in the tight press of combat. It was the perfect weapon for finishing the job the pylon had started. This lethal combination of an armor-penetrating, shield-disabling javelin, a large protective shield, and a deadly short sword, wielded by highly trained and disciplined professional soldiers, made the Roman legion the master of nearly every battlefield it set foot on for half a millennium. As armies became more professional and cities grew wealthier, they were surrounded by ever stronger and more complex fortifications. This gave rise to another great field of military innovation, siege engineering. War was no longer just a matter of pitched battles in open fields. It was now also a slow, methodical science of breaking down stone walls. The undisputed masters of this grim art in the early Iron Age were the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire was a state built on a foundation of conquest and terror, and their military was a brutally efficient machine, particularly renowned for its siegecraft. They developed a comprehensive suite of specialized technologies for overcoming urban defenses. They would build massive earthen ramps up to the walls, allowing their troops to bypass ditches and assault the ramparts directly. They employed corps of sappers protected by large shields to dig at the foundations of walls, causing them to collapse from below. Most fearsome of all, they deployed the first truly terrifying siege engines, most notably the armored battering ram. This was not just a simple log carried by a few men, but a massive house-sized vehicle, a wheeled wooden chassis covered in wet animal hides to protect it from enemy fire arrows, with a huge metal-tipped ram suspended within the frame. This allowed the ram to be swung with tremendous rhythmic momentum against a city's gates or walls, slowly pulverizing them into rubble. The Assyrians combined these physical tools with psychological warfare, depicting their brutal victories in horrifying detail on palace reliefs, a clear message to any other city that might contemplate resistance. But the true revolution in siege warfare came with the invention of artillery, machines that could hurl heavy projectiles over long distances using stored mechanical energy. The Greeks, with their love of mathematics and physics, developed the first torsion-powered artillery in the 4th century BCE, under Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great. Torsion machines derived their immense power from the twisting of ropes made from sinew or, surprisingly, human and animal hair, which had excellent elastic properties. A massive bundle of these ropes, called a skein, would be stretched tight within a wooden frame and then twisted to an incredible tension using levers and winches. When a trigger was released, the unwinding of the skein would unleash a huge amount of energy. The ballista was a two-armed machine, essentially a giant crossbow that could fire heavy iron-tipped bolts or round stones with pinpoint accuracy over hundreds of yards, capable of skewering an enemy soldier or shattering a battlement. The catapulta, which later evolved into the Roman onager, was a single-armed machine, a kind of giant sling that could lob massive stones, sometimes weighing over 150 pounds, in a high arc. These stones would crash down on the roofs of buildings and into the streets of a besieged city, shattering infrastructure and terrorizing the defenders within. These machines represented the pinnacle of ancient mechanical engineering. They were complex to build and operate, requiring a detailed understanding of geometry and physics to calibrate and aim correctly. The Romans adopted and perfected this Greek technology, creating massive artillery trains that accompanied their legions, allowing them to systematically batter any rebellious city into submission, while the settled empires of the Mediterranean perfected the art of infantry warfare and siegecraft. A different kind of military revolution was taking place on the vast open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. Here, nomadic peoples like the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Huns, and later the Mongols developed a form of warfare based entirely on mobility and missile power, centered on the horse archer. Their key technological advantage lay in two critical inventions that worked in perfect synergy: the composite bow and the stirrup. The composite bow used by the steppe nomads was even more advanced and powerful than its Bronze Age predecessor. It was often reflexed, meaning it was curved away from the archer when unstrung, which added even more tension and power to the draw. This design packed an incredible punch into a small package, making it ideal for use on horseback. A skilled Hunnic or Mongol archer could fire 6 arrows a minute, using a thumb draw technique that was faster than the Mediterranean three-finger method, and do so from the back of a galloping horse, hitting targets with deadly accuracy from over 100 yards away. This created a form of warfare that settled infantry-based armies found almost impossible to counter. The horse archers would not close for combat. They would ride in circles around an infantry formation, a carousel of death, peppering them with arrows from all sides, exhausting them, and thinning their ranks until they were weak enough to be charged and finished off with lances and sabres. The second invention, the stirrup, seems incredibly simple in retrospect, but it was a complete game-changer for mounted warfare. First appearing in a recognizable form in China and spreading westwards along the Silk Road, the stirrup provided the rider with a stable, secure platform. Without stirrups, a rider has to grip the horse tightly with his legs, making it difficult to use a lance or a sword with full force, as the rider's own body acts as the pivot point. With his feet braced in a pair of iron stirrups, a cavalryman was now firmly anchored to his horse. He could stand up in the saddle to shoot a bow more accurately, or to absorb the shock of movement. More importantly, he could now deliver a powerful thrust with a lance, coupling his own momentum with the full mass and velocity of his charging horse, without fear of being unseated by the impact. This transformed the lancer from a mere spear poker into a devastating shock weapon, the forerunner of the medieval knight. The combination of the powerful composite bow and the stability provided by the stirrup made the steppe horseman the most dominant military force in the world for over 1,000 years. It was this technological and tactical superiority that allowed a relatively small number of Mongols to conquer a vast empire, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. Finally, we turn our gaze to the sea, where warfare drove its own unique path of innovation. In the confined, island-studded waters of the Mediterranean, naval warfare was not about long-range gunnery. It was about ramming and boarding. The ultimate expression of this doctrine was the trireme, developed by the Phoenicians and perfected by the Greeks in the 5th century BCE. The trireme was a light, fast and agile galley, propelled by 170 oarsmen arranged in 3 tiers to maximize power without making the ship impractically long. Its primary weapon was a massive bronze-sheathed ram fitted to the prow at the waterline, designed to punch through the timbers of an enemy hull. Trireme warfare was a high-stakes, high-skill affair, requiring incredibly well-trained crews who could row in perfect unison to achieve bursts of speed and execute complex maneuvers. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, where a smaller Greek fleet of triremes used their superior agility in confined waters to defeat a much larger Persian invasion force, was a victory of superior technology and seamanship, and it arguably saved Greece from conquest. Later, the Romans, who were not natural sailors, came up with a typically pragmatic and brutal solution to level the playing field. They invented the corvus, or crow, a large hinged boarding bridge with a heavy, pointed spike on the underside. When an enemy ship drew near, the corvus would be dropped onto its deck, the spike would bite into the planks, and the 2 ships would be locked together. This effectively turned a naval battle into a land battle, allowing the superior Roman legionaries to storm across the bridge and overwhelm the enemy crew. One of the most terrifying naval inventions of the ancient world came much later, from the Byzantine Empire, the inheritors of Roman science, Greek fire. This was a closely guarded state secret, an incendiary weapon, a precursor to modern napalm, that could be sprayed from bronze siphons mounted on the bows of Byzantine warships. Its exact chemical composition remains a mystery, but it was likely a petroleum-based mixture combined with substances like sulfur, resin, and quicklime. It was terrifyingly effective because it could burn on water, making it impossible to douse, and it clung to the hulls of enemy ships and to their unfortunate sailors. In an age of wooden ships, flammable sails, and pitch-corked seams, Greek fire was a devastating psychological and physical weapon that helped the Byzantine navy defend the city of Constantinople from numerous naval assaults for centuries. From the spoked wheel of the chariot to the torsion spring of the ballista, from the curved shield of the legionary to the composite reflex bow of the Hun, the technologies of war are a testament to the darker, more competitive side of human ingenuity. They are born of fear, aggression, and the relentless desire for power, yet they undeniably propelled us forward. The demands of metallurgy for stronger swords and tougher armor gave us a deeper understanding of material science. The logistics of supplying a legion on the march required the construction of roads, bridges, and aqueducts that served civilians for centuries. The geometry needed to aim a catapult also helped us to understand the heavens. In the ancient world, military innovation was a primary engine of change, shaping the destinies of peoples and the borders of empires. The clash of armies was also a clash of technologies, and more often than not, it was the society with the sharper edge in intellect, in organization, and in iron that prevailed. In the modern imagination, our world is defined by its connectivity. We live in an age of instant communication, of satellites and fiber optic cables, a world shrunk by the engines of jets and the speed of light. We think of the global network as our own unique invention, a product of the last century. But this is an illusion of perspective. The desire to connect, to trade, to explore, and to understand the wider world is as ancient as civilization itself. Long before the first bit of data was ever transmitted across a wire, the ancient peoples of the world were weaving the very first global networks. These were networks not of silicon and code, but of sailcloth and stone, of camel trains and celestial observation. They were driven by the same impulses that drive us today: curiosity, profit, faith, and the unquenchable human desire to know what lies beyond the horizon. The technologies that enabled this first age of globalization may seem primitive to our eyes, but they were as revolutionary in their time as any satellite, and they laid the essential groundwork for the interconnected world we now inhabit. Our story of this great connection begins on the water, in the cradle of civilization, the Mediterranean Sea. This vast inland sea was the first great highway, a nexus of cultures, empires, and trade. But it was also a place of danger and uncertainty. For centuries, its horizons were a barrier. Its first true masters, the people who turned it from a barrier into a bridge, were the Phoenicians. Operating from a narrow strip of coastline in modern-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians were not mighty conquerors in the traditional sense. Their empire was not one of land, but of ports and trade routes. Beginning around 1500 BCE, their ships became a common sight from the shores of Egypt to the coasts of Spain. Their primary innovation was the development of highly practical and seaworthy merchant vessels. Unlike the long, slender, and fragile galleys built for war, Phoenician cargo ships were broad-beamed, deep-hulled vessels, disparagingly called goloi, or bathtubs by the more warlike Greeks. They were designed not for speed or aggression, but for stability and maximum cargo space. They were built with a sophisticated shell-first construction technique, using mortise and tenon joints to fasten the planks together before the internal ribs were inserted. This created a strong, flexible hull that could withstand the rigors of the open sea and carry heavy loads of timber, wine, and precious metals. But a ship is useless without the knowledge to guide it. In the early days, sailors practiced coastal hugging, a cautious and time-consuming technique of keeping the shore in sight at all times. But the Phoenicians were more daring. They were among the first to systematically practice celestial navigation, using the predictable movements of the stars to guide them on direct, open-water voyages, dramatically cutting down travel time and risk. They sailed by night, steering by the constellations. In particular, they relied on a star that was, for them, uniquely reliable. While other civilizations used the conspicuous Big Dipper to find north, the Phoenicians recognized that it revolved in a wide circle around the celestial pole, making it an imprecise guide. They instead oriented themselves by a dimmer, but far less mobile star at the end of the Little Dipper's handle, a star we now know as Polaris. The ancient Greeks, in fact, called it the Phoniki, the Phoenician star, in honor of the people who taught them its value as a navigational aid. By measuring the altitude of this star above the horizon, likely using just their hands and fingers as a simple measuring tool, a Phoenician navigator could get a remarkably good sense of his latitude, his north-south position. This allowed them to establish a vast trading network, founding powerful colonies like Carthage in Tunisia and Cadiz in Spain, trading valuable Lebanese cedar, their famous purple dye, and fine glassware for tin from Britain, silver from Spain, and copper from Cyprus. They were the great connectors of their age, weaving the disparate cultures of the Mediterranean into a single economic and cultural web. As Phoenician power waned, Their role as the Mediterranean's great explorers was taken up by the Greeks. Driven by a unique spirit of scientific inquiry, a desire not just to travel but to understand, Greek sailors and thinkers sought to map and measure the world. The most extraordinary of these explorers was Pytheas of Massalia, a geographer and astronomer who, around 325 BCE, embarked on one of the most remarkable and courageous voyages of antiquity. Sailing from the Greek colony of Marseille, he passed through the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, a place of myth and terror for most Mediterranean sailors, and turned north into the vast unknown Atlantic. He systematically charted the coasts of Spain and France, then circumnavigated Britain, providing the first detailed description of the island he called Albion and its triangular shape. He wrote of its Celtic inhabitants, their customs, and their methods of farming and mining tin. From Britain he sailed even further north, into a land he called Thule, 6 days' sail from Britain. His description of this place, where the sun barely set in summer and the sea became a sluggish, frozen slush, has led scholars to believe he may have reached Iceland or even the coast of Norway. What makes Pytheas truly remarkable is that he was not just an adventurer, he was a scientist. He brought with him a gnomon, a type of sundial with a vertical pointer, which he used to measure the length of the sun's shadow at noon on the summer solstice. By comparing his measurements at different locations, he was able to calculate their latitude with impressive accuracy. He was also the first Greek to connect the daily rhythm of the ocean's tides to the phases of the moon, a profound insight into the workings of the cosmos that would not be fully accepted for centuries. Though many of his contemporaries dismissed his accounts as fantasy, Pytheas's voyage represents a crucial shift from navigation as a purely practical tool for merchants to exploration as a scientific endeavor, an attempt to rationally comprehend the shape and workings of the known world. While the Phoenicians and Greeks were mastering the sea, the Romans were mastering the land. The Roman Empire, at its height, was a vast and complex entity, stretching from the cold mists of Britain to the hot sands of Mesopotamia. Holding such a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire together required more than just military might. It required a system of rapid communication and logistical support. The Roman solution was one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world, the Roman road network. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was for centuries a literal truth. The Romans constructed over 250,000 miles of roads, of which nearly 50,000 miles were paved with stone. These were not simple dirt tracks. Roman roads were sophisticated, multi-layered structures, built to be durable, direct, and usable in all weather conditions, a philosophy fundamentally different from the winding surface-level paths of other cultures. The construction of a major Roman road was a serious engineering undertaking. Surveyors would first plot the most direct route possible, using tools like the gromer to lay out straight lines, and sighting posts to traverse hills with minimal deviation, preferring to make deep cuts into hills rather than go around them. Then a wide trench would be dug down to bedrock. The road would be built up in a series of layers, like a modern highway. The foundation, or statumen, consisted of large flat stones fitted together to provide a stable base. Above this was the rudus, a thick layer of smaller stones mixed with concrete or sand. The next layer was the nucleus, a kind of concrete made with gravel or sand, which was compacted and smoothed. Finally, the road was topped with the summum crusta, or wearing course, consisting of large, tightly fitted polygonal paving stones, sloped gently from a central crown to the sides to allow for proper drainage into ditches. The result was an all-weather highway that was incredibly durable, so durable, in fact, that many modern European roads still follow the exact routes laid down by Roman engineers 2,000 years ago. These roads were the arteries of the empire. They allowed the legions to march quickly, at a rate of 20 miles a day to any troubled frontier. But their non-military importance was even greater. They were the conduits of trade, allowing goods to move from province to province with unprecedented speed and safety. They were also the backbone of the cursus publicus, the state-run postal and transportation service. A series of way stations, or mutations, were set up at regular intervals, where official couriers could exchange their tired horses for fresh ones. Larger mansions provided overnight accommodation. This system allowed a vital message to travel from one end of the empire to the other at an average speed of 50 miles a day, a rate that would not be consistently surpassed in Europe until the invention of the railway. To mark the distances, the Romans erected milestones or millennia along all major roads. These were stone columns inscribed with the distance to the next town and often to Rome itself, along with the name of the emperor who had built or repaired the road. These milestones were a form of information technology, orienting the traveler and constantly reinforcing the immense scale and reach of Roman power. The road network bound the diverse peoples of the empire together, fostering a shared economy and a sense of Roman identity. It was the physical manifestation of a connected world. Even with the best ships and the best roads, true global navigation requires a more abstract and powerful technology, a system for accurately describing any location on the Earth's surface. The intellectual framework for this was created by one of the greatest minds of antiquity, Claudius Ptolemy, working in the Great Library of Alexandria in the 2nd century CE. In his seminal work, the Geographia, Ptolemy synthesized centuries of Greek geographical and astronomical knowledge to create the first comprehensive system for mapping the world. His monumental invention was the application of a grid system to the entire globe, the concepts of latitude and longitude. Latitude, the north-south position relative to the equator, could be determined with reasonable accuracy by observing the height of the sun or key stars. Longitude, the east-west position, was a much harder problem, as it requires comparing the local time with the time at a fixed reference point, a task that was virtually impossible for ancient sailors without accurate clocks. Ptolemy's calculations were often wildly inaccurate. Most famously, his overestimation of the width of the Eurasian landmass would later convince Christopher Columbus that he could easily reach Asia by sailing west. But the system itself, the very idea of a universal grid, was revolutionary. For the first time, any location, from a tiny island to a great city, could be given a precise pair of coordinates, a unique address on the face of the Earth. Ptolemy's work, rediscovered and translated by Arab and later European scholars, would form the absolute foundation of all cartography and exploration for the next 1,500 years. To make practical use of these astronomical concepts, sailors needed practical tools. One of the most important of these was the astrolabe. Its theoretical basis was developed by Greek mathematicians, but it was perfected into a highly sophisticated and beautiful instrument in the Islamic world during its golden age. The astrolabe is a kind of mechanical model of the heavens. It consists of a solid brass plate, the mater, which is engraved with a stereographic projection of the sky as seen from a specific latitude. Over this plate rotates the rete, an intricate web-like overlay that shows the positions of the brightest stars. By holding the device up and aligning a sighting rule, the alidide, with an observed star, a user could read the star's altitude from a scale around the edge. By then aligning the rete, the user could determine the time of day or night, identify stars, and most importantly for navigation, calculate their latitude. It was a kind of ancient astronomical computer, a handheld device of immense utility and intellectual elegance. While the astrolabe allowed for the determination of latitude, the problem of finding one's bearing, especially in cloudy weather, remained. The key to solving it lay not in the heavens, but in a peculiar property of the Earth itself. The invention of the magnetic compass is one of the most significant, yet most mysterious innovations in history. The first clear references to a magnetic device for indicating direction appear in Han Dynasty China around the 1st century CE. But it was not initially used for navigation. It was a divinatory tool, a south-pointing spoon made of lodestone placed on a smooth bronze plate, used by geomancers for feng shui, the art of aligning buildings and graves in harmony with the cosmic currents. It took another 1,000 years before Chinese scholars in the Song dynasty, around 1040 CE, first described the use of a magnetized iron needle, either floated in a bowl of water or suspended on a silk thread, as a navigational device for mariners. This technology slowly trickled westwards, likely transmitted through Arab traders who had extensive contact with China via the sea routes. By the 12th century, the magnetic compass had appeared in the Mediterranean. It was a world-changing invention. For the first time, a sailor had a reliable way to determine direction, even when the sun and stars were obscured by clouds. It allowed for year-round navigation in more northern, frequently overcast climates like the Atlantic, and it gave navigators the confidence to strike out into the vast, featureless expanse of the open ocean, the greatest land-based network of the ancient world. A network that relied on all these threads of innovation was the Silk Road. The term is a modern one, coined in the 19th century. It was not a single road, but a sprawling, ever-shifting network of caravan trails and oasis cities that connected the Roman Empire in the west with the Han dynasty of China in the east. For over 1,000 years, this network was the primary conduit for goods, ideas, religions and technologies across the vast and forbidding expanse of the Eurasian continent. The technologies that made it possible were perfectly adapted to its harsh environment. The primary beast of burden was not the horse or the donkey, but the Bactrian camel. With its 2 humps for storing fat, its ability to carry enormous loads for long distances, its capacity to go for days without water, and its wide, splayed feet that were perfect for traversing sandy and rocky terrain, the Bactrian camel was the ship of the desert, the biological engine that powered the Silk Road. To support these vast caravans, a network of caravansary sprang up along the routes. These were fortified roadside inns, often built around a central courtyard with a well, offering food, water and shelter to merchants and their animals, acting as vital nodes in the long chain of commerce. But the most important things traded on the Silk Road were not physical goods. Alongside the bales of Chinese silk, Roman glassware, and Central Asian horses, a far more precious cargo was being transported: ideas. The Silk Road was the world's first great information superhighway. Buddhist teachings, originating in India, traveled east along the Silk Road to become a dominant religion in China, Korea, and Japan. Christianity and Manichaeism traveled from west to east, and technologies made the journey as well. Paper-making, as we have seen, traveled from China to the Islamic world. The stirrup, which revolutionized cavalry warfare, made the same journey. The Silk Road was a testament to the fact that no civilization is an island. It was a dynamic, multicultural network that irrevocably shaped the development of the entire Eastern Hemisphere, proving that the exchange of ideas is often a far more powerful force for change than the clash of armies. Our final journey takes us away from the familiar continents of Eurasia and into the vast blue emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. Here, one of the most remarkable and least understood feats of navigation and exploration in human history was accomplished by the Polynesians. Using Stone Age technology, they settled a vast triangle of the Pacific, from Hawaii in the north to Easter Island in the east and New Zealand in the southwest, a region of ocean many times the size of Europe. Their key technology was their vessel, the double-hulled voyaging canoe, or wā kolua. These were not simple dugouts. They were large, sophisticated craft, sometimes up to 100 feet long, consisting of 2 parallel hulls carved from single tree trunks, connected by a central platform on which a shelter was built. This catamaran design made them incredibly stable in the open ocean and fast when powered by their distinctive crab-claw-shaped sails, which were highly efficient at capturing wind energy. But the true Polynesian technology was not the canoe itself, but the immense and intricate system of navigational knowledge known as wayfinding. This was a science passed down orally through generations of master navigators, a science without written records, magnetic compasses, or astrolabes. Polynesian wayfinders navigated by developing a deep, intimate and holistic connection with the ocean environment. They used the sun's rising and setting points as a natural compass. By night they relied on a mental map of the stars, knowing the precise rising and setting points of dozens of them, and using zenith stars, stars that passed directly overhead a particular island, to home in on their destination. But perhaps most remarkably, they learned to read the ocean itself. They could detect the presence of distant islands far below the horizon by observing the subtle patterns of ocean swells. A deep water swell, traveling for thousands of miles, will be refracted by the landmass of an island, creating a distinctive and predictable pattern of interference on its leeward side. A master navigator, sitting low in his canoe, could feel these subtle changes in the rhythm of the waves, interpreting them to find his way to a tiny speck of land in the middle of a vast sea. They also used the migratory patterns of birds, the color of clouds that tend to gather over islands, and the scent of vegetation on the wind to guide them. This was a technology not of metal but of the mind, a complete system of environmental knowledge that allowed them to achieve what was, by any measure, impossible. They were the celestial sailors, the true masters of the ocean, and their voyages are a powerful reminder that high technology is not always about the complexity of the tool, but about the depth of the knowledge that guides it. From the Phoenician merchant charting his course by the North Star, to the Roman engineer laying out a road straight as an arrow, to the Polynesian wayfinder feeling the echo of a distant island in the waves, the story of ancient navigation is the story of the birth of a connected world. These first global networks, built with remarkable ingenuity and courage, were the threads that began to tie the scattered family of humanity together. They proved that no ocean is truly impassable, no desert is truly barren, and no horizon is forever out of reach. They were the first World Wide Web, a network woven from sailcloth, stone, and the silent guiding light of the stars. And so our long journey through the starlit corridors of the past comes to a close. We have seen how the simple act of scratching a symbol into clay gave humanity a voice that could echo through eternity. We have stood in the shadow of impossible structures, built not by magic, but by the sheer stubborn will of human hands and minds. We have walked the fertile furrows turned by revolutionary ploughs, the very tools that allowed our numbers to swell and our cities to rise. We have felt the grim weight of the hoplite's shield and heard the deadly whisper of the horse archer's bow, reminders that ingenuity can be a double-edged sword. And finally, we have sailed on phantom ships guided by the silent wisdom of the stars and the sea, on the first great networks that began to weave our scattered world into one. These inventions are our inheritance. They are the silent, invisible architecture of our own lives. The next time you read a word, cross a bridge, or simply look up at the night sky, remember that you are never alone. You are standing on the shoulders of giants, the sleepless innovators of the ancient world. Sleep well.